For this interview, I'm in the RAF Club in Piccadilly, and I'm going to be speaking with Air Commodore Steve Thornber, Head of RAF Intelligence. And today we're going to be speaking about the secrets of RAF intelligence. Thank you so much, Air Commodore, for coming to be interviewed today. So the RAF, of course, is just over 100 years old. Can you tell me something about the relationship between the RAF with the air and military intelligence?
The formal standing up of the Air Intelligence Directorate was in 1918, but you could argue that as long as people have been climbing trees, they've been looking over the horizon, and as long as man had aeroplanes, then aerial reconnaissance has been a thing, and that was one of the reasons that the Air Force had a primary role of intelligence. And Lord Trenchard, when he stood the service up, that was one of the guiding principles. So formally in 2018, as the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Naval Air Service collapsed and created the Royal Air Force, there was a need for an Air Intelligence Directorate. And then you see in the interwar years that mass of people they had begins to sort of shrink slightly. And in the mid-30s, you start to see some of the sort of the structures of what we would recognise today. A lot of the things that we do today, apart from the equipment and the speed of things, a lot of it's very, very similar in a way. Our compadres from 1918 might not be so surprised by what they see today. What they'd be thoroughly surprised by is the speed of things, the complexity of things, and the amount of different people who are in that air intelligence space, and where air intelligence officers are actually having an effect. It's a history as long as the Air Force is, and longer, and it's a fairly common theme throughout the Air Force's time that this role of intelligence is pretty key.
And it was Group Captain Winterbottom, wasn't it, Chief of Air Intelligence in 1939, who was attached to what we know today as MI6, or the Secret Intelligence Service. So was there a particular reason why he was involved with MI6?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story, actually, and in some respects that wouldn't have been quite so odd back then, because, as you say, Military Intelligence 6 was part of the War Office. It was a natural thing within the defence construct, or the war construct then, for these groups to work together. So not quite as alien as perhaps the relationship between a single service today and the SIS as a separate intelligence agency. Trenchard, as I said, had really had talked about reconnaissance. There had been a challenge in really doing reconnaissance. It had been very, very tactical in the First World War, and it has stayed quite tactical in the interwar years. So where Winterbottom was interested in, he was interested in strategy and strategic depth. He was interested in what the Germans were going to do, and this started sort of before 1939. The Air Force itself was probably a little bit behind where Winterbottom was. But one of the things the Air Force was doing at the time, and Air Intelligence was doing, was coordinating across Whitehall in different departments, but also coordinating with the Armée de l'Air, the French's Deuxième Bureau. And that was where Winterbottom came in, because MI6, SIS had that relationship with that organisation, and he comes into the story. Now, he had a relationship with a chap called Mr. Miranda, who was an American industrialist, who happened to know a chap called Sidney Cotton. Sidney Cotton is quite an interesting character. He had been a Royal Naval Air Service pilot in the First World War. Possibly fair to describe him as a little bit difficult to command and control. Quite a flair, quite a spirit. In the interwar years, Sidney Cotton, one of the things he'd been into was prospecting. He'd been experimenting with high-level reconnaissance. So a number of the innovations that we ended up using in the Second World War actually came out of Sidney Cotton's interwar years, perhaps sort of generated by mineral exploitation rather than war. Cotton was a big believer in the ability to get an aeroplane over a patch of ground and take pictures. So Winterbottom and Cotton together, and they got a co-pilot, a Canadian co-pilot called Niven, who they took out of the regulars and put him on the reserve list, so they could effectively sort of clean him up and make sure that he wasn't connected to the military. And this industrialist, Miranda, they managed to procure a small fleet of Lockheed 12As and Beechcraft and put French cameras in there with the link to the Deuxième Bureau. And the French were quite energized in getting the strategic depth of the imagery, because of course they were closer to the impending problem. And all of that together then delivers this capability, which at the same time the RAF is not necessarily recognizing. Interestingly, the Germans before the war had recognized that the Air Force that had the best reconnaissance would prevail. They had the best cameras, I think, arguably, but they also had a very regimented way of doing their reporting. So I think quite stifling. And you compare that with this machine that Winterbottom and Cotton, Niven, and another character called Longbottom, who'd been brought in. He'd been a pilot who'd done some interpretation of pictures, so he was seconded to the Air Ministry to do the exploitation of the pictures. It's one thing collecting it, it's another thing knowing what's on it. So the four of them together started the Air Camouflage Unit, and that was the beginnings, and it was a little nest egg. There's a lovely story a little bit later on. They did do these strategic reconnaissance flights over France. They looked at the Germans and the Italian targets in the Mediterranean. And this is obviously before the war. Cotton and Niven were flying these Lockheed Electras out of Berlin Tempelhof Airport. And the story is told that Goering spotted this thing on the pan there and said, "What's that?" Somebody scrolled over and it's a British businessman, an entrepreneur called Sidney Cotton, and so they went over and asked for a flight, and Cotton flew them around Germany, secretly filming whilst they were going. Isn't that marvellous? About a year or so later, they were having this discussion with the Air Ministry about the efficacy of doing strategic flying. So, and this came out of this chap Longbottom I talked about, who was the chap who came to do the analysis. He had written a paper that basically said this can be done. We need to use light, unarmed aeroplanes that can use speed and height and to evade the enemy fighters. The connotation there is that really that was going to take a fresh Spitfire off the line, or a number of fresh Spitfires off the line, and you can imagine how a sceptical audience just wouldn't see the value in that. So Cotton and a number of others were at various meetings with the Air Ministry, still quite resistant, the Air Ministry noting that it really didn't have the ability to do the exploitation en masse. There were questions about the ability to take good photographs. The second story goes that Cotton loses his cool in one of these meetings, storms out, goes and flies, and walks back in the next day with a fistful of fresh prints and throws them on the table and go, "You mean like these?" And that's supposed to be one of the moments that things change. I'm sure there's much more to it than that, but it's a lovely story. That securing of that nest egg through that MI6 interest, the French connection, an Australian entrepreneur, a Canadian co-pilot, Longbottom brought from the line to do the exploitation. That's where we get the beginnings of this, I think, battle-beating capability and the exploitation that then makes the difference versus the Luftwaffe way of doing things. It's a marvellous story.
So it's quite innovative, isn't it? It's thinking outside the box, would we say, really?
I think so. I think the lovely thing about it, in a way, and this is something that I and my colleagues need to continue to think hard about, is, if you like, it's a parallel, and I might be being quite simplistic, but it's a parallel between a very engineered, efficient German machine that had a lot going for it, and this kind of crazy lunacy, probably not very efficient, but much more effective British machine. Or Allied machine, because of course the Americans join later in the war and they just bolt onto the side of it. And I think there's an interesting juxtaposition there, that if you over-regiment, you lose some of that innovation. On the other side, as we'll possibly talk about later, when you get to mass, you do need to be able to professionalise and grow cadres. So there's a real tension there, and actually Cotton himself didn't last too long in that unit, and I think it was about 42 that he was supplanted gently, maybe not so gently, by people in this uniform, and I think his value had probably passed.
Not many people know there was an RAF intelligence school in the Second World War, cover name RAF Highgate. Can you tell me a bit about that and its purpose and the kind of things that they achieved there? I understand there's some kind of training.
So, yes, all the different services had different schools, and of course the Army and Navy schools came from quite a longer background. At the initial start of education, professional education of an intelligence cadre, there were a number of locations here in London, and obviously that's not very efficient. So you get the amalgamation of them coming together at Highgate. They offered 3 kinds of courses really. So by this time in the war, you had technical intelligence beginning to start. You had POWs and defectors and people to interrogate. So it wasn't just using imagery, using photographs and listening for enemy signals. So they ran a course that was called the A course. That was a course for about 17 days. I don't know why 17 days. I suppose that was a bit of a tension, like it is today, between getting people on the front line and the things you need to put in their heads. That was really more aimed at Air Force officers that had about 3 or 4 months of operational time somewhere, and they would be selected, like a lot of the intelligence, the personnel in intelligence jobs, including those that go to Bletchley Park and Medmenham. There's a little bit of a process of people talent spotting. There's also a bit of a process of looking for certain skill sets. The kind of people we're talking about now would be people who would be expected to go and understand and think about the problems that air intelligence has. So how do you keep airplanes safe? What's the enemy doing in terms of building up an air force? Where are they? Those sorts of things, and that's very similar to when I was a kid, the kind of things that I was taught as a young flight lieutenant. So a little bit of operational experience, then into the Air Intelligence School, and then back out onto squadrons and stations to do their jobs. And you see those characters later being the person that might do the initial debrief of air crews, or might do the initial readout of imagery before it goes to the photographic interpreter specialists, or in some of those organisations where as an air specialist they're understanding what they're seeing in a way that somebody might not if they didn't know how an airfield worked, for instance. There was then the B course. The B course was for those people that were going to interrogate prisoners of war or be involved in that interaction with Germans. I mean, just thinking about that as a job, you have to be a bit more experienced, a little bit steadier, a little bit more savvy. So you tended to find more senior people went to that job, to that course, and that course was also open for the other services and eventually for Americans.
And would they have to be fluent in German?
So most of them would have some German, but they would have German linguists in all of these organisations. So if you were up front with the Germans, then yes. If perhaps at Trent House you're listening to Germans who aren't aware they're being listened to talking, a linguist can be there, and then the layer behind that, the intelligence officer can be sort of looking at the translated language and working out what that means. And then there was a C course, and the C course was really for the ab initio. And as you imagine, as the war goes on, all of a sudden we need a lot more people. So when we start the war, it's really dealing with those that are regulars and some augmentation. That augmentation starts being these specialists that we draw up from various different places, and then you have to eventually build a cadre to get the mass. So these are the kind of people that go onto this ab initio course, and they're really taken from ground zero. They've not really served operationally in the Air Force yet. They really don't know much, and they're taught the basics. They'll then find themselves perhaps operationally out there, and then perhaps dotting through those other courses. And the other part of that really was there was a little bit of selection there too. That's not the case today. When you recruit to a course, you're already selected for the course. The instructors are looking at how you're doing and trying to make sure that you learn and you can be an effective operator. I think back then that sort of structure wasn't there. So there's a little bit of, do these people we brought in the door ab initio, are they going to be the right fit for the kind of jobs we want them to do? So I imagine a few of them didn't necessarily fail academically, they might have failed character-wise or something else.
And the school had its own motto And badge?
Yes,
Is that correct?
it did actually. Yeah, so I have one here.
Nice.
So this is the crest of the school, and it's a nice bit of a history. It obviously originally would have had the George crown on. The symbology is the black sphinx, it's wisdom, and it's behind it is a heraldic sun for illumination. The motto in Latin, premonitus, is basically means forewarned is forearmed. And it's quite a striking emblem. The reason this exists today as the crest for the school is because of the way the school was subsumed from those war years into a central school, and then that became part of what is today's school for intelligence officers, and today we have a joint school, and in that there's an air intelligence wing. So the chap who ran it at the time a few years ago, I think it was about 2014, a chap then called Skordnida Fuchta, did some work on this, and because he could prove the lineage of it, it was an easy task then to get this readopted. So this now is the badge of today's school. Today's air intelligence officers graduate with that as their motto and as their badge.
Ah, so you've got that continuity.
Yes.
And then the branch itself, there's a slightly different, more recent motto, isn't there? With
so this is the
yes.
branch badge. There are a lot of badges that are related to intelligence units. A number of flying squadrons have badges that actually look a bit like this, a bird in flight, often a raptor. So this badge was actually signed off by the Queen just a couple of years ago. This is relatively new. And the symbology is remarkably similar in a way. Before we had the Sphinx and the sun, actually the colours kind of are very similar. That was actually not necessarily fully intentional, but it's a wonderful bit of symmetry there. So this is a raven. The raven symbolises knowledge, wisdom. It's Odin's messenger. And the lightning bolt in gold is the power. And then the motto, ex obscurata in lucem, is actually the same motto as a flying squadron that unfortunately no longer exists, the number one photographic reconnaissance unit, which goes all the way back to those days of Cotton and Winterbottom and Longbottom. This is a nice symmetry with our flying colleagues. The symbology is quite striking. I love the story. This was brought about on the ingenuity of then Group Captain Mark Ridgway, who was my predecessor really in terms of looking after the branch. And he received this from the Herald, and he took a look at it and actually decided that the raven wasn't quite aggressive enough. So it went back for a bit of sharpening up. And it's quite a moody looking raven. Yeah,
it's striking, isn't it? Yeah. That's what struck me when you first showed me, that sort of moody raven, yeah.
The wings raised represent protection and speed. So it's a lovely badge, a lovely story. Just a little anecdote, for grins, I am referred to as Raven 1 as head of the branch.
And just going back to the Second World War, the tri-services cooperation between Army intelligence, naval intelligence and air intelligence was relatively new from my understanding, but actually a huge success and in many ways overcame a lot of the inter-service rivalry. Can you comment a bit on that and the sheer importance of this during the wartime?
Yeah, so I think in some respects it's not new. It keeps coming back in history. So you go way back and you look at the Roman fleets and there are soldiers on those fleets, and you look at First World War where you've got naval infantry in the land role, and there's an old quip at some stage the Army had more ships than the Navy had at the beginning of the Second World War. So it ebbs and flows, and I think in the interwar years you get that sort of re-entrenchment, and you also get a lessening of the resources in intelligence. So as well as an entrenchment, you've got fewer folk, and they're not meeting as much. So by the time you get to the Second World War, of course, these are new people, and they don't know each other, and they don't really know of each other. Even in the Second World War, in the first part of the Second World War, it's a while before you see the jointness, as we would call it today, these combined units. One of the great successes, in my mind, was the Central Interpretation Unit. So you had in the Army and the Navy in particular, the analysis of, for instance, the photographs, would really be about the tactical ground and where things are fairly close. These joint units really focused on things that were much deeper, much further away, bigger problems. And you really need that mix of people to come together to give you the knowledge, the breadth of knowledge, to have those big thoughts about these really big problems. So that's one of the important things that comes out, and that's one of the drivers that causes that. We've got bigger problems to solve than a single service organisation wants to or can solve. And then there's also some efficiencies in there in terms of, for instance, again, taking that imagery example, you've got a system that eventually builds up with imagery flowing off the airfields to this central point, and the centralisation of processes, the centralisation of deeper reporting, and it builds into quite an organism in a way. And it was the same in a way with the signals intelligence. So at Bletchley Park, you had those amazing developments in things like the bomb and Turing's computing. And you had lots of people cracking codes, and the Enigma story is pretty well told. But of course that's fed by people on airfields, on ships, in various tactical places who are receiving this. And the RAF story is a lot about the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and what we would call the Y squadron. So in the Army, Navy, Air Force and Royal Marines, you get these little Y organisations feeding things to Bletchley, which was X, hence X and Y. So that you still needed that Air Force provided or fielded capability, but these joint things allowed us to get after the more difficult problems. And then that became a really obvious place for when the Americans joined the war. In 42, we obviously had an awful lot of experience. So what they did is they just effectively took their intelligence organisation, or their intelligence organisations, and bolted them, grafted them rather, I think is a better phrase, onto this allied, or rather onto this Commonwealth capability. And then in that case, the Central Interpretation Unit becomes the Allied Central Interpretation Unit. Right. The secret about all of that really is that, or the greatness about all of that is, that's the foundation, that trust, that understanding of each other, the growth of the tradecraft, the higher esteem in which nations hold each other because they work together. That's the very foundation of the US-UK relationship after the war. And then from our perspective, that then leads to what today we would refer to as the Five Eyes, this very solid, interwoven capability. And as the UK's ability to look after its global concerns has inevitably shrunk, partly as empire shrank, partly as resources have been tested. That relationship with our partners across the globe, that's fundamentally why we are able to do the kind of things we do today.
And Five Eyes, just to remind our audience, being which countries?
In those days it would be the Commonwealth and the US, and the Commonwealth would be Britain, the United Kingdom, and Australia, Canada, New Zealand. And of course, although by that stage they're clearly independent countries, the way that the war effort and the War Office thought about them, there was this group here of Commonwealth countries, and then there was the US. If you remember the First World War, when the Americans first came into the First World War, they had much more in common with the French. Their reconnaissance in the First World War was they grafted onto the French system. They used French cameras, French aeroplanes. So there was quite a division between the US reconnaissance path and the British. So it was quite alien in a way to see the four Commonwealth countries, and in that Commonwealth batch, you've got lots of other people. And you think about all the nations that were in the Battle of Britain, for instance, and then in comes the US. So you only find the Allied term applied when the US join. Today we'd find that quite alien, because if an Australian walked in the room, that would be an Allied situation. If a Canadian walked in the room, that would be an Allied situation.
Are there any operations in terms of RAF intelligence and this joining up and cooperation that stand out for you personally?
Yes, there are. I unfortunately can't talk about them particularly, but the recent ones. But I think there's some really good examples from history that I haven't lived through, but speak to me from that time, because I recognise a lot of the things they tell me, and a lot of the lessons I was taught were from those times. So if you take Overlord, Operation Overlord, and think about the immensity of that, understanding the geography, understanding just the sheer task of taking all of those people somehow without the Germans noticing, and getting them up the beaches and setting all that logistics and going into German-held territory. So many things about that are unfathomably difficult if you don't know what you're going into. So a lot of the reconnaissance that was required for that was started. I suppose a lot of it had come out of the reconnaissance we'd collected, from sort of 1940, 41 and onwards. But very specifically, about early 1944, you start seeing a machine that starts taking requirements for the landings. And there are a number of wings that are reconnaissance wings in the RAF, and one of them is supporting what will become the British endeavour. One of them is supporting what will become the Canadian endeavour. And then the Americans are obviously here with the United States Army Air Force. And then there were other squadrons, the squadron called 140 Squadron, that was doing lots of sort of reconnaissance of beach obstacles. There were flights of American P-51 Lightnings in a reconnaissance role, flying what we call oblique imagery, sideways imagery, down the beaches.
Oh yes, I remember, yeah.
This had to be done in a way that took a lot of beaches in, so an awful lot of risk had to be taken to fly an awful lot of the French coast to not sort of zero the Germans in on where we were really going.
Yes.
So that's quite interesting. There was imagery taken of the Germans were putting underwater obstacles in, and they were putting air obstacles in. So there was imagery taken of the what we'd call the littoral zone through the water, and those are all mapped out. There was an effort to look at all the German coastal defences, and in fact on the 6th of June, I think of some 98 radar stations, only 4 operational, because they had also been reconnoitred and largely dismantled by Bomber Command. That allowed then this huge flotilla to form up sort of 24 hours out, undetected, and to actually come in. So all of that beach and depth recce, all the recce you'd need if you were an engineer and needed to put an airfield down somewhere, or put some logistics down somewhere, or if you're infantry, Marines landing on the beach, stop you getting snarled up before you get to the beach, stop you getting snarled up on the beach. Remembering things like the Dardanelles campaign, where quite a significant part of the failure there was a lack of that preparation. Of course, that was a very solid lesson in that. So that's a wonderful, huge story, and it's not really an operation per se, it's all for Operation Overlord. It was a massive effort. Compare and contrast that a little bit with, for instance, a very personal story of a lady called Constance Babington Smith, who was a Women's Auxiliary Air Force officer. And one of the things that Constance is well known for is discovering the V weapons. There were a number of other people in the mix there, but Constance is the champion, if you like, for that. And I found myself, when I was going through imagery analysis training many, many moons ago, the benefit I had is somebody was teaching me all these bits of equipment, and I kind of knew what they were. There were already rockets. I knew what they were. There were already bombers and planes and industry, and I just had to learn the difference between them. What Constance really did, which I think it takes a bit of thinking about, is she recognised the importance of a little cross on a grainy image in the middle of occupied France, next to lots of other things that would be quite difficult to identify. And just think about the curiosity and the persistence it took to do that, and then actually the faith it must have taken to go, there's something here, and to have to persuade people that it was really important. That leads its way all the way through to Operation Crossbow and the dismantlement of Peenemünde and the V1s and the V2 capabilities. That to me, it fascinates me that somebody at whatever time it was in the morning, probably, because that tends to be when you find these things, actually paused and went, do you know what, I think that's something.
But with both of those examples that you've given, it's intelligence, isn't it? At the end of the day, the successes were because of the preparation from the intelligence side. And really, I think for me, listening to your stories, it's underlying the huge significance of military intelligence, of RAF intelligence, wherever, you know, this whole cooperation made this possible, isn't it?
I mean, my very humble part in it, you sort of try and draw that lineage. I think there is something about the word intelligence and activity, because this intelligence required the cognitive intelligence of these people. And going back to what do we extract out of this? When we were required to bring all these experts together, we had no choice. We selected them for the things that they knew. So if you were an architect,
yes,
you might have gone to Medmenham. If you were a mathematician or a linguist, you might have gone to Bletchley. What we try and do now is we try and inculcate into our professionals some of this knowledge. What we lose in a profession in a way is the sort of the eclectic lunacy that comes from bringing these people together with no military background. What we gain is a repeatability, and I think part of my job and our job is to encourage these individuals, because these are stories about individuals at the end of the day and groups of individuals, often with huge courage. Spitfire pilots alone, Lysander pilots flying SOE agents into occupied France. The individual acts of courage, the moral and mental courage that it takes to go, do you know what, I think this is something. That's something you have to inculcate. It's something you can't learn in a book, and it's something you have to give a bit of freedom to. So there's a period in a young officer's life where actually you really want them to make mistakes, but with somebody around them to make sure that it's not a critical mistake and just easy tiger, come back from the edge there. So that's that mentoring and coaching role.
So is there a sense then that intelligence has made a difference, would you say, in particular conflicts and operations?
Yes. I have never been involved in an operation that didn't have intelligence as part of it, so I've never lived that experience, but I mentioned the Dardanelles earlier, and that's an example, perhaps, of one of the key issues there was the lack of that planning and that intelligence. There were others, but that was one of them. In different endeavours, the bigger and the more strategic the endeavour, the more unknown there is. So I think in some respects, actually just getting approval to do an operation requires that intelligence. You hear people today talk about precision weapons. Precision is a term that talks about the engineering precision of something. If I pull this trigger at this point, that weapon will do exactly that time and time again. That's precision.
Yes.
But it might be the wrong thing it's doing. That's accuracy. And to get accuracy into precision requires thought and planning and intelligence. So I've sometimes quipped that the Royal Air Force has a lot of precision weapons, and precision weapons have revolutionised warfare from Gulf War I onwards. But it's the intelligence professionals that have given the accuracy into that. One of the important things about that is, about that accuracy, is it given an awful lot of things you have to do, it allows you to be much more efficient. So you could engineer your way out of a problem if you had enough time and enough stuff. But if you don't have enough time and enough stuff, you have to be really accurate first time. And that gets even more interesting in today's world, where we don't just talk about dropping weapons, we talk about influencing, we talk about having the information edge, we talk about these soft effects. And actually to provide the accuracy for that, because that's not a precise engineering thing, to provide the accuracy for that is an even tougher set of problems that actually needs a much broader mix of people. One of the things that will really damage an intelligence organisation or the intelligence input to an operation is if there isn't sufficient diversity of thought. diversity of thought requires a multitude of experts from different areas, and it requires a culture and training to avoid our natural biases that we all have, and there's nothing we can do about that. That's a fundamental part of training today. I often find that it's our intelligence officers that are formally trained in countering those biases in a group of fellow sort of military and civilian colleagues. And that's something they bring to it. So sometimes I do hear them say, well, let's just have a think about that. I think you've gone from A to C. Where's B? Oh, that's a really good point. So that's part of it as well, I think. Commanders, politicians would far rather have definite future gazing. We often can't do that. Often what we can do is we can understand the dynamics enough, understand the detail enough, and lead a discussion. And that it's a bit like the phrase attributed to Eisenhower, it's not the plan, it's the planning. It's the thought, it's the playing with the ideas, the dynamics, that's what allows a staff to succeed. And that's really one of those areas that intelligence and other expertise bring to it. It's the ability to talk around the complexity, because no problem's ever as simple as we want it. And more so today, crazily more so today. My morning, I wish I could talk about it, has been a wonderful example of that. And it's that depth of nuance of talking about, of listening to policymakers, listening to their challenges, and being able to offer how other things will look, what these odd things that they're seeing can mean, what they definitely won't mean, what they could mean, what these potential futures are, what we might see if we're actually tending more towards future B than A and C. And that then engages them in this in the intelligence business, because now they're looking at the things that we're collecting and these things we call indicators and warnings, and they're invested in that, and we shape those indicators and warnings around the thresholds in their decision making and policy making, instead of just some ethereal question that we've made up. Yeah. That's really centered around the real problems that they're dealing with. That allows us to think about how we collect. When you look back at how things have matured by the end of the Second World War, you see the same things. You see the same requirements and behaviours. And then it's just in this interregnum between the wars where it sort of fades away because it's unresourceable. So I think our challenge to today's generation is don't fall into an interwar period. Luckily, some other global players are making sure we don't do that.
Can I ask you finally, because this for me has been so illuminating today, finally to comment really on the lessons of the past that, well, the most important lesson, what would you say is the most important lesson from the past for today, for today's intelligence and analysis?
I think part of it is it's always more complicated than you think. As you start turning stones over, it's always more complicated than you think. That hits at probably the greatest factor in military and political failures, hubris. Mm-hmm. So one of the antidotes to hubris is details and a cogent argument. It's not always worked, but it's one of the antidotes. I think it makes me, it keeps me confident that that this world that we're in today, where it's unconscionable for us to do things on our own, particularly in the single services in the main. It always seems to be a collaborative team effort, and that team is just a much bigger team than one might imagine. It's all sorts of experts. So, that tells me that we're in about the right place. I was once told that if I ever found myself in a room full of people that looked and sounded exactly like me, I should get up and go. I should be really nervous. That's the wrong place to be. And this sort of the delight, I think, of my 35 years of what I laughingly call my career, has been this diversity, this constant challenge. It's kind of invigorating. It kind of keeps you. I was going to say it kind of keeps you young, but clearly it didn't. But it kind of keeps you focused and honest. I think those factors are what comes screaming out of those generations that took a while to restart. But when they got it, they would recognise a lot of what we're talking about.
Air Commodore, thank you for taking time out of your schedule and to talk to me today about the history and the current challenges of RAF intelligence. It's been a huge honour for me to be with you today, so thank you so much. And I've been absolutely delighted to be speaking today with Air Commodore Steve Thornber on the secrets of RAF intelligence, here right in the heart of Piccadilly in the RAF Club in London.
This has been a production for the National Centre for Military Intelligence. To find out more and to support the NCMI, please visit ncmi.co.uk.